Good morning. Today we are going to be talking about Dave the Potter, and we also call him Sir Dave. He's a master potter, as you know, but he's also a poet. And we call him Sir Dave after Jonathan Green. How many of you know Jonathan Green's work? Anybody know Jonathan Green's work? He's a South Carolina painter and one of the most famous painters, particularly of low country art in the entire world. And he decided that he wanted to paint a full series on David Drake as an artistic ancestor that he did not know about when he was young. He didn't know about any black artists from South Carolina who had preceded him in their fame and their creativity. And so when he found out about David Drake, who people called Dave the Potter, he decided he wanted to bestow him with a name befitting of his dignity, and to make sure that people didn't refer to him just by his first name as people did when Dave himself could be sold just the same way as his pots could be. So you'll see a lot of the paintings of Jonathan Green in the background as the dancers and performers stage Dave's life. I'm Professor Foreman. I'm a professor of history and literature at the University of Delaware, and I'm the project historian on this collaboration. I want to talk a little bit about what slavery would have been like if all of us lived on a plantation together in South Carolina. So if we were all enslaved together in South Carolina, most of us would be doing what kind of work? Yes? Farming. We would be doing farming. What kind of farming? What kind of crops would we be? Actually, Cotton, absolutely. Cotton, and what else? Yes. Was that a hand in the pink? Nope, just hair. So what else would we be doing? Yes. Tobacco, and what else? Indigo, yes. What else? Rice, there we go. All right, so those are the four major crops that we'd be engaged in, what we call cash crops, that we would be planting, but also clearing, and then sowing, and then picking. And we'll see a little bit of that, because even if you were an artisan like Dave, the vast majority of people you were living with would also be working in, right, or in your community, be working in the fields. All right, so that's about 80% of us. That's all of us, all right? We're in the fields, and that's not particularly good work. That work is out in the elements. There are overseers or drivers who are making sure that you do that work. And how do they ensure that you do that work? Yeah. How do they ensure that you do the work? With lashes, right, by beating you. And so they're white overseers, and then when you have black folks who are doing this work, we call them drivers. Now, being a driver, and that's maybe just us, we're the drivers right here. There aren't a whole bunch of them. And if you're a black driver, what kind of job do you have? You are ensuring people work by, so that if they come short, if their cotton doesn't weigh enough every time, you end up actually beating folks that you're with. So it's a conflicted, difficult job. You want that job? I don't want that job. All right? So, but it's a job that people also took because they could, well, they weren't told. It's not like they had a choice, right? But they also could protect people. Right? There was a kind of zone of protection. So if you had to beat someone, you could make sure you didn't put the lash on too hard, right? So there are these conflicted roles under slavery that you were forced to do, but that you could begin to create a zone of protection within an absolutely oppressive atmosphere. Does that make sense? So we'll see a black driver in the production today. All right, and then some of us would be in the house. We're in the house. What kind of work are we doing in the house? Yes. I'm sorry, what? I heard somebody say the right thing. Yep. Cleaning. Is that what you said? Yep, cleaning. What else? Cooking. Cleaning, housework. taking care of the babies, all right? So this is the kind of work that gets done. Now, when we're talking about cleaning and taking care of the babies and working in the garden but not the field, they would pick children as young as 6, sometimes even 5, picking the grubs, right, off of the plants, weeding, for example, washing dishes, and taking care of children. So Harriet Tubman, for example, was hired out, and when she was 6, she was responsible for taking care of a baby who was just born and hushing her. How many of you have younger siblings? Okay, how hard is it to keep them quiet at night? All right, how many of y'all have babies who are teachers? All right, okay, so it is hard, right, to keep babies quiet at night. And if you didn't keep them quiet, what happened to you? You couldn't sleep. So the mistress could not sleep and she would not be happy. So what would she do to the person who was supposed to keep her quiet? Yeah, she would beat her, right? So she would beat her. You got it, babe. You just said it in unison with her. The two of you had that. I'm sorry. You got it. All right. You were good too. All right. So, and Harriet Tubman had those scars on her back from when she was hired out away from her family to another farm to take care of a mistress's child when she was 6. She carried those scars to her grave. All right, so field work and housework was also very difficult. Now there's just us over here, and we're the artisans right here. What do artisans do? What do artisans do? Yes? Say that real loud. Stand up, say it real loud, baby. No? What? Make pottery. They make pottery. What else do they make? They paint. Now that's a fine artist, even more than an artisan. What else? Yeah, you're just gonna read it off of that, right? They're woodcutters and weavers, and they're creating things that, what do artisans have in common? Weavers, potters, right? Woodworkers, metal workers. What do they have in common? What kind of thing are they making? Types of art, and it is art that you can use, right? So this is utilitarian art, and that's what an artisan does. An artisan makes art that you can use, and a fine artist makes art that is what we call the decorative arts, the arts that decorate, that you can look at. Now, the other difference between an artisan and an artist is who signs it. So if there's an artist, the artist, when you see a painting, is there a name in the corner usually? All right? But an artisan, when you see a scarf that is woven or a blanket, is the artist's name on that? No. That's the difference between an artist and an artisan, and that's one of the things that is miraculous about Dave. Dave signed his name on pots. This is metalwork. It is not the work of an enslaved man, but it is the work of someone whose genealogy, the way that he learned, the ancestry of the people who taught him were enslaved. And these skills were passed on from one generation to the next. And you can see this work by Philip Simmons in Charleston right now. So when you go to Charleston, look for this kind of metalwork. This is black metalwork done by people who learned their handiwork from enslaved populations. All right. Now, Dave made his owners really rich and famous, but they never freed him. And they sold his pots, which again was used to store syrup and food and lard all over the entire South. These are some of the biggest pots anybody ever made from that era. They are huge pots from that time. And they were so accomplished that they end up in some of the best museums across the country. I'll show you that in a minute. He was so valuable that when he lost a leg in what we think was a train accident, they got another disabled slave whose arms were crippled to turn the bottom. Let's see if I got my balance. I'm not a dancer, right? To turn the bottom while he shaped the pot, right? So that's the way that the pottery was made at that point. There was a bottom that you turned that made the top turn where you could shape the clay. And they got a disabled man who would actually, an enslaved man, who would turn the bottom. All right, so that's how valuable he was. And he continued to make these pots until he was freed by the Civil War. Now, this isn't the case for all talented enslaved people. Phyllis Wheatley, who was enslaved in Massachusetts and is the second woman in the United States, white or black or Asian American or Chicano or lo que sea. She was actually freed by her enslavers, but Dave never was. But still, his pots ended up in the most famous museums in the country, and you can see them now. In the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, so when you go to Boston, you can say, they made that in my state, right? In the Smithsonian National Museum in DC, in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And you can also go just down the street to the Greenville County Museum of Art and see the largest collection of Dave pots in the entire country. Not only was Dave one of the most accomplished potters in the world, he actually wrote poetry on his pots. And he did this at a time when no enslaved people in South Carolina were allowed to learn how to read and write. In fact, it was illegal, and it's enshrined in law in South Carolina, one of the harshest laws in South Carolina, in all of the South, that said that if you read or write and were enslaved, you could be sold south, and you could be separated from your family, and you could be tortured, because they were so worried about the literature of abolition or anti-slavery literature getting into the state and disrupting the slave economy. Why? Because by 1860, enslaved people together were the most valuable asset in the entire United States by far. Now, how did he learn how to read and write? We think he learned how to read and write when he was enslaved by somebody named Abner Landrum. And Abner Landrum actually had a newspaper. And even when you had a newspaper, you had enslaved people who were working on the type. Did you guys know that Benjamin Franklin actually owned slaves at the beginning? And his newspaper in in Philadelphia, his newspaper had slavery advertisements when slavery was legal in Pennsylvania as well. So they used people to set the type and also to do the physical work of the printing. And we think that he was doing that kind of work for his owner. And not only that, in the newspaper itself are these quotations. So you see the British poets and poetical quotations, a complete dictionary of the most elegant, moral, sublime, and humorous passages. And he writes these humorous couplets on his pots. Now, it's really interesting because most people write poetry on what? What do we get poetry on? Paper, right? In books. But he never wrote anything that we know of on paper. We have not one single thing that exists of Dave writing on paper. But we have countless pots that he incised poetry on. Now, tell me about his name here. Is that big lettering or small lettering compared to the rest of what's on that pot? It's small lettering, but tell me about Dave. Does Dave stand out compared to the other words? Is it big or small? It's pretty big. Is this a man who's trying to hide who he was? No. So what kind of feeling do you think he brings to this pot with his name like that? Happy. What else? Confident. What else? Bold. What else? Encouragement to other people too, that they could learn how to read. That's really smart, right? Yes. That's right. Great. There's a kind of pride, a kind of confidence, right, that he puts on this pot. He is not trying to hide who he is, right? He is trying to show off who he is. And this is pretty remarkable considering the fact that you could be sold and that it was illegal. These are some of the couplets. I wonder where is all my relation. What does that mean? Who is he wondering about? Yes. His family. He's wondering where his family is. When you're wondering where your family is out loud on a pot, is that a critique of slavery, or is that like slavery's all good? Is that a critique? Is he critiquing slavery by saying, I wonder where is all my relation? Yeah, he is, right? Because if my family was with me, if I knew who my parents were, right, then I wouldn't have to wonder where all my relation is. So he is critiquing slavery on a pot and signing his name. That's bold, right? And he's just doing it pretty subtly. And this other poem here, A Pretty Little Girl on a Verge, Volcanic Mountains, How They Burge, we interpret this to think about the ways in which he might have had a daughter or a wife, right? Or someone he loved who was sold away from him, who was sort of put into the volcano, sacrificed into the volcano of slavery. And you'll see, right, this, a young woman being sold away from her friends, also in this performance. He wrote scores of verses. Some were biblical, some were funny, some were whimsical, and they were all couplets on his pots. Now, the three poems you just saw were all written right after the Dred Scott decision. This is one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in the entire country and in the entire 19th century, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court wrote this decision, and it says that blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. We're going to say that in a minute again, one more time, because it's one of the most infamous, embarrassing, bad decisions the Supreme Court ever made. That blacks have no rights that whites are bound to, a little louder. Blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. Now, what did Aretha say many years later, right? What do we, okay? R-E-S-P-E-C-T, that's what you can give to me. In some ways, the black civil rights struggle has been about regaining that kind of respect as citizens, as people who have contributed to this country. And this decision was overturned by the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that comes right after the Civil War that frees enslaved people, at least legally. All right. Being an enslaved artisan was less brutal than it was to be in the house or in the field. But you and your spouse or your best friends or your religious leaders could always be sold away. And you were a witness to the kind of brutality, a witness to the kind of toxicity, the witness to the kind of cruelty that was enacted on plantations and smaller homes that had slaves across the entire country. Being an artisan is not quasi-freedom. That means in between kind of freedom. It's not close to freedom. Nothing under slavery floated above the power of those who enslaved you. But Dave survived, and so did his work. And after the war, we know he voted because we have his name on voting rolls. We know he took on a last name, David Drake. And we also know that he was counted in the census records. And not only did he survive, but his pots survived. And we have been inspired by those pots and the poetry that's on them to bring you this creative performance and production of Sir Dave today. Thank you.